So I want to take a second to welcome everyone who has joined so far. We're really excited to have Judson here today to share his knowledge on this topic. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Judson.
All right.
To go ahead there.
Okay, Sue. I want to say good evening to everyone. Sue called me an expert. I don't consider myself an expert on the topic we're going to address tonight, but I am someone who works in this field on a daily basis, both personally and professionally. I've addressed the issues that we're going to talk about this evening, so hopefully I can share some experiences and background that are helpful to people. Also, just wanted to take a second and acknowledge that this is a very difficult time for all of us with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the killing of George Floyd, and we're not here to talk about those things, but at the same time, I feel like it's worth acknowledging that we're going through some hard times, and hopefully growing, whether you're doing it in a greenhouse or a high tunnel or in the field, and somewhat therapeutic as we move through these challenges. So I'm going to move forward with my topic. Since I can't see any of you and I can't hear any of you, I really do encourage you to enter questions into the chat if I'm not clear at any point, and I'll try not to look at that. I'll let Sue moderate that. But I'm going to move forward with the topic, and again, slow me down or speed me up as you need to. So what I'm going to talk about tonight really is how we deliver nutrients through an irrigation system. That's primarily what we're going to talk about. Now, there's two major approaches to this in terms of delivering the quantity of the nutrients, and that's really the key here, is how much are we delivering? I'm talking about the quantity we deliver to a crop, whether that's containers, flowers, vegetables, fruit for that matter, and we measure that in either parts per million or pounds per acre. They both have their advantages. For greenhouse growing, oftentimes we work with parts per million. It's the best approach, particularly when we're growing in a container, because we assume that there's very little or no nutrition within that container, that soilless media. If we're growing a mature crop out, let's say it's a tomato or a cucumber or anything else, in a container, that's also the best approach. Pounds per acre is most useful when we're growing in the soil, whether that's a high tunnel or a field. The good news is we don't have to choose. We can do either one. And sometimes we do, we can do both. And sometimes we do both. There's certain situations where I really like the parts per million. Particularly, I like using parts per million when I'm not sure exactly how much I'm going to have to irrigate my crop. Because when we take this approach of fertigation, the delivery of water is linked to the delivery of our nutrients. And so then that can create a problem if, let's say, our media or our soil is saturated with moisture, but we need to deliver some sort of fertilizer, some sort of nutrition, then we're restricted in how much we can deliver. So this is why a lot of growers still use some sort of pre-plant program, putting down some nutrition in the soil. And this applies to organic and conventional growers. Organic growers tend to apply more pre-plant because they have less soluble materials. We'll get into that.
Hi, Amy.
All right, moving forward. This is an injector. It's not one I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight, but really what we're seeing here is a siphon or a hose-on type of system where to the right-hand side of the slide, you see the hydrant, the water comes in. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a black hose that then leads up to this horizontal system here that's tacked up onto a 2x4. There's a number of pieces there. Ignore the caulk gun. The farmer just hung that there. But we have a filter. That's the first black piece you'll see. Then you actually see a timer. That's the blue kind of cylinder. Then we have, I'm not even sure what that part is. That's a mixer. Then we have all the way to the left, you have the siphon or the hose-on injector. And this type of system is not a parts per million system. It's more of a pounds per acre because the delivery rate of the product varies with the pressure coming in and the pressure going out. It also tends to inject the material very rapidly. Sometimes around 1 to 116 is the ratio. Whereas our typical greenhouse fertilizers, when we take a parts per million approach, are doing 1 to 100. So if you're taking a pounds per acre approach, for example, I want to deliver 5 pounds of nitrogen per acre to a tomato crop per week, this system can work just fine for that. But it doesn't allow the precision approach that we prefer when we're dealing with parts per million. For that situation, we like to use what we call injectors. Two major brands are Chemilizer and Dosatron. I'm not endorsing either of those. Dosatron is noted because it has variable rates. Chemilizers tend to be fixed rates. Both of those major makes, and most greenhouse injectors for that matter, are water driven. They don't depend on electricity or any other power aside from water pressure. And that water pressure then helps pull fertilizer into the system. So I want to talk about the two primary functions of these injectors. The first is acidification of water. Now these are the common uses. There's other uses for these things. For example, you could try to sanitize water with them. You could do other things with them. You can measure, for example, how much water am I applying at any given point, regardless of fertilizer. But the two most important functions that we're going to talk about tonight are acidification of water, that's lowering water pH, and then fertigation, which is a fancy way of saying nutrient delivery, fertilizing the crop through an irrigation system. So I'm going to walk through a couple of these setups with you. These are real life photos from my work here in New York primarily, of what the injectors look like. What are the key components to the system? So Sue, can you see my cursor or not if I move it around the screen?
I can, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. So the basic parts of the system is we have water coming in. That's on the left-hand side of the image. My cursor is dragging over that hose. That comes in. There's another one of those timers. That is a very good investment. We can talk about that more if you'd like later. But that just controls a valve on and off, so the farmer can come in and dial that thing to 50 minutes and walk away from it. That's a very simple version. There's others that are a slight step up and are run by batteries, and then you can actually set a time, say 7 a.m., 10 a.m., 1 p.m., whenever you want it to irrigate. But this thing will close after the number of minutes that the farmer sets. Moving up, I now arrive at the injector system itself with all this PVC, and you can see there's valves. Here's one that is closed right now, and that forces the water to move across here, this first set of plumbing. If I want to bypass the injector, which is in the middle of the setup here, for any reason, all I have to do is open up this valve, and I would close this one, and then the water would do an end run around that, and no water is entering the system. No fertilizer is entering the system. Now you have in the center of the setup, the injector. Again, water driven. There's no electricity run to this thing. And a little tube running down into a bucket. This bucket we call a stock bucket or our stock solution. And that is where our fertilizer or our acid is going to go. These are oftentimes run by a piston inside, and that piston then siphons this concentrated material in the stock bucket up into the injector where it's mixed at a given ratio. And this is where the greenhouse injectors outperform the field siphons in that all of the water leaving this injector as it moves to the right of the gray thing here in the center is going to be at a given ratio of fertilizer to clear water. That ratio oftentimes is 1 to 100 or 1 to 200. There's all kinds of settings. You can move it up, you can move it down. For me, 1 to 100 is the easiest one for me to conceptualize, and it's the one I work with the most. As the fertilizer leaves the injector, the water now that is diluted, let's call it 1 to 100, There's a filter here that can be periodically opened up and cleaned out, and then it's exiting and ready to go into an irrigation system. Now that could go out to a drip tape, that can go out to a hose that is used to manually water things. One of the advantages to these setups is that now I can create multiple buckets that have multiple stock solutions. And oftentimes some of our fertilizers are not compatible with each other. For example, calcium, in the case of calcium nitrate, that can really create problems if it's combined with some other materials. It can precipitate out in these stock buckets and become insoluble. So similar system, water comes in from this hydrant, and now the grower can move between different buckets. Those buckets could have, again, nitrates in one, it could have sulfates in another, it could have phosphorus in another. I can move those around now and change them if I want to.
Judson, I had a question from a grower here. How do you prevent backflow?
How do you prevent? Yeah, you have to generally, where I am, if you're connected to a municipal system, so if your water comes from the town, you need to have an engineered system put in place that is going to do that, and it needs an engineer stamp on it before you can go forward with that. There's anti-backflow devices or fittings that can go on here, and it's a very good question because anything in these buckets, if there's any backwards pressure on the system, can flow into whatever your system is, whether it's a well or anything else for that matter.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Let's see here. Where am I going with this? Just more options. I don't like seeing all these fertilizers stored on the ground. I'll say that while we're talking about safety issues. And what's really scary in this one is here's a gallon of acid. That's highly caustic material and shouldn't be left out there, particularly where you've got kids around. Or anybody for that matter. Someone could kick that and severely burn themselves. This situation isn't much better with all those fertilizers kind of sitting out on a table like this. But what I want to point out here is that these systems then can be used for overhead irrigation if you're watering baskets, hanging baskets of flowers. And you can see each one of these lines going out of the system can be shut on or off if you don't have enough water pressure to have them all open at the same time. You can see right here, the grower has two zones open. Maybe they don't have enough water pressure, or maybe they have a set of plants that need more, whatever it is, nitrogen, let's say, than their counterparts. So then you can change the dilution in your stock bucket. You can change stock buckets. You can change the ratio on your injector, any one of those things, and then just concentrate on that crop's individual needs. So it's kind of a manifold that they've installed here to address different crop zones. All really straightforward, typical plumbing that you can do yourself, not hard to do. Okay, now my text here is in black. It's supposed to be in white. But the water test is the first test that makes this whole system work. We have to know the quality of the water we're working with, whether it's the container plants that we see above this tomato crop or the tomatoes that are in the ground here. Testing our water is the first thing we test, and unfortunately it's probably the last thing many growers do test. What type of test am I talking about? Primarily I'm looking at pH, which is a measure of acid to basic, acid to alkaline, with 7 being neutral, and then the alkalinity. The alkalinity I'm not going to go into great detail on, but in short, it's often called bicarbonates or calcium bicarbonates. And what the alkalinity measures is the buffering capacity of the water. Think of it as liquid lime in your water. And you need to know how much liquid lime you have in your water to know how much you're going to acidify your water to reach your target pH. I'm going to hopefully make this clearer to you in the next few slides. So this is a an image I'm sure all of us have seen. I'm not even sure where I grabbed it from, but the message here is that most of our nutrients are more available at lower pHs. So if 7 is neutral, we want to be on the acid side of that, generally 6. Certain flowers would be like to be way down in the lower 5s, petunias, calibrachoas. Most of our crops are going to be okay at 6, 6.2. That's a good target and satisfies probably the nutrient availability of as many crops as possible. So to get to that target pH of, let's say 6, just to make things easy, we are going to add an acid to the system. This is a picture I took. It's sulfuric acid. There is a number of other ones. There's phosphoric acid, nitric acid, and then certified organic growers need to use citric acid. The question of any of those is how much. And this is where the injector comes in, because we often are dealing with tiny, tiny amounts of this acid. One of the greatest tools that we have out there for making this calculation is an online spreadsheet. University of New Hampshire hosts this. It's called AlcCalc. Hopefully you can see that there. Just put that in a search engine and it will get you there. And you can put in all these things, your pH of your sample, the alkalinity of your sample, and your target pH. I oftentimes put in a target alkalinity of around 50 parts per million, and that's oftentimes listed as CaCO3. If you really want to focus on your pH and get to that 6, you can put that into that field. But you can't do any of this without a test. So you've got to take that sample, get it to a lab, whether it's your local land-grant institution or another lab that you like working with. These are very simple tests. I don't worry a lot about the lab's ability to get it right. Those are very simple tests to do, pH and alkalinity. And once you have those values, you can enter these into the spreadsheet and you'll find out how much acid you have to use. You can also work with your local extension educator on this as well. Let's see, I've got a few slides out of order. There is no citric acid on this spreadsheet. So I'll get to that calculation in a little bit. But citric acid is generally in the same ballpark as sulfuric acid. Ballpark I'm talking about. Generally a couple of ounces per 100 gallons of water is the rates that people I'm working with use. Again, that depends on your alkalinity and your pH, but we're talking about very small amounts, half an ounce, 1 ounce, 2 ounce per 100 gallons. So this is why the greenhouse level injector is important, and the field injector can't do that for us because it can't measure that in a constant rate and keep that where it needs to be. And you could flush out a lot of very acid water at one time and then follow it with a lot of higher alkalinity water and really defeat your purposes altogether.
There's a few questions
Go ahead.
from here. What about pH meters that you might buy and have on your own farm?
Absolutely. So the digital meters, I prefer those to strips. People talk about using the color strip to see where they are. That's okay, but I think the $100 or $150 that you spend on a digital meter is the way to go. I use one from Hanna Instruments. Hanna, I don't think they sell directly, so you've got to go to some other scientific dealer or anyone who, any company that works with forestry or laboratories. And those Hanna pH meters, again, not a brand endorsement, just my personal experience. They need to be calibrated, so you buy some calibrating solutions. I won't go into the details on that, but it's a very good idea so that you can see, am I getting to my target pH by measuring the water that's coming out at the end of the hose after you've done your injection.
Okay, are there any other tests that you would recommend doing on your own if you can't get the lab test?
Well, yeah, so if you can't do the lab tests or you're too cheap, I know a lot of people like that. I'd probably throw myself in there. you could do the before and after test that we kind of just talked about, which is you can look at what's my pH now, and I can start with a tiny amount of acid and see, and then inject it again at a 1 to 100 ratio. And when I say a small amount, I mean a small amount. Like I would say begin with 1/4 of an ounce, because you don't know what your alkalinity is. And so if your pH is high, but your alkalinity is low, you will need a very small amount of acid to get to that pH, that target pH of 6. Whereas if your pH is high or even moderate, you'll need a lot more acid. Excuse me, if your pH is high and your alkalinity is high, you're going to need more acid to get there. So if you're going to do the before and after test by yourself without a lab, just go very slow. Start with small amounts of the acid, whether it's sulfuric acid or citric acid. Start with, say, 1/4 of an ounce per 100 gallons. So, and then move up in quarters or halves until you get to that pH that you want to be. And check that every so often, because your water source may change over the course of the season. The other thing I'll suggest, if you're on municipal water, town water, they will be able to provide you with a report of what that alkalinity and pH looks like, usually for free. As a ratepayer or user of that water, generally you're entitled to know what those numbers are. Let me be clear, when I talk about these stock solutions, and I say 1 ounce per 100 gallons, in that stock bucket, I'm talking about 1 gallon if I'm at a 1 to 100 ratio. So every gallon in that stock solution is going to be diluted into 100 gallons of irrigation water. So when I say 1/2 of an ounce or an ounce of acid per gallon in that stock bucket, or per 100 gallons, it's the same way as saying 1 per gallon in that stock if you're going out 1 to 100. And another quick safety note, you want to add your water first to the stock bucket before you add the acid. Just remember, acid is very caustic. It can and will burn you if it's mishandled. So add the water first and then the acid. That's much safer. The growers I work with, just so you're aware of this, are generally not above 2 ounces per 100 of any acid per 100 gallons of water. Just to give you a ballpark on this, we're talking about halves, ones, 1.5, 2, just in that ballpark per 100 gallons of water. And I'm talking about sulfuric and citric acid mainly. Should I keep going, Sue?
Yeah, I think that's good for now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. So I did have a citric acid slide in here. Hopefully it shows up someplace else. It wasn't where I wanted it to be. But those ballpark figures I gave you apply to citric acid as well, which is, again, that's your OMRI. Make sure it is OMRI labeled, but only citric acid is your only legitimate OMRI acid. The reason we're doing that is to get our nutrients where they need to be. And here they are. And I won't go into any more detail. There's that citric acid chart. Okay, so what you can see here, I mentioned that the sulfuric acid and citric acid are fairly comparable in quantities. And to neutralize 50 parts per million alkalinity, they have here citric acid at, let's call it 1 3/4 ounce versus sulfuric acid, let's call it 1.4 ounces. So very similar. Okay. Now we're focusing again on parts per million right now. We can switch to pounds per acre if and when people are ready. But now that we've lowered our pH to where it needs to be, we've taken a water sample. Some of you will take a water sample and find that you don't need to change your pH if your water supply is already low enough. Many people will. And if you're growing flowers, most people do in the Northeast. Now I've reached my target pH. I want to look at what are my nutrients. Okay, so NPK, I'm not going to get into great detail on all of those different nutrients, but what I want to point out is that there are established rates in parts per million of those nutrients based on your crop. So here's tomatoes. This is a hydroponic crop. And when we're early on in production, you can see I want 224 parts per million of nitrogen. And over time, as that crop matures, I go down to 189 parts per million. This is from the University of Arizona. Great greenhouse program there. Potassium does the opposite. It actually goes up, particularly in its ratio to nitrogen as time goes on. I start out at 280 and I want to go up to 341 parts per million. Okay, so these are guidelines, they're established, they're out there, and the injectors help us do that. Now the question is, how do I know how much fertilizer to put in my stock tank? So again, I look at how many parts per million do I want to achieve? Generally, we're talking about nitrogen. It doesn't have to be the only one, but generally we're talking about nitrogen and other nutrients in a ratio to nitrogen. So I can establish with this equation my desired parts per million. So let's say based on that previous slide, I want to be at 180 when I'm harvesting tomatoes. So 180 would go over the percent of my fertilizer of nitrogen multiplied times 0.75. So I could do this on my phone in a second. I can simply want to be at 180 parts per million. I hope you see that. And let's say I have a 20% nitrogen. Let's say I'm using a triple 20. Bad example for a tomato fertilizer in my opinion, but easy to conceptualize. It's triple 20, 20% nitrogen. So 20% of, or 0.75 times 20 is going to be 15. So I'm going to divide 180 by 15. That gets me to 12 ounces of fertilizer per 100 gallons of water in my stock bucket. Very, very simple equation. And you can use that with dry fertilizers. Most of us are probably not going to do something that simple. We like our online calculators. So you can go back to the University of New Hampshire's site and look at their fertilizer calculation. This is a nice one in that it also includes acid in there, and you can see if your acid is contributing any nutrients as well. I don't need to walk you through that. Click on this page. This is from Dosatron, one of the manufacturers. They have a number of calculators here. Click on those. You put in what is your percent nitrogen and what is your desired parts per million, and it will get you there. Very, very easy. This is what it looks like. You can also simply look on the back of the fertilizer bag. It's that simple. Most greenhouse fertilizers are going to have a chart on the back of the bag. And I shouldn't say most, but many, that will say if your injector is set 1 to 100 and you want to achieve X parts per million, here's how much you add to your stock bucket. So this is very, very simple. And most of the time, the math is already done for you. You don't have to memorize equations. It's right there if you want it. But there's a lot of resources to help you through that. So again, I need to know what is my percent nitrogen. And I'm going to highlight some organic products here because I think it's important to note that a lot of the working science behind what we're talking about is built on conventional products. It's built on highly soluble, highly available forms of NP and K, as well as all of our micronutrients. We are seeing more and more soluble forms of organic, certified organic fertilizer. These are just a couple I grabbed off the internet. Now, again, not endorsing them. I don't have experience with this product. I do have experience with other organic products, injecting them myself. But we can begin to apply some of this working science now to soluble organic materials. Can we afford to do it? I'll let you figure that out. Some of these materials are quite expensive. We do want to look and see, is the material soluble? You can see here I've got 10% water soluble nitrogen, 2% insoluble. And I also want to look at, am I contributing any phosphorus, any potash? And oftentimes I'm going to have to make an adjustment. We can also do this for micronutrients. So most of our greenhouse grade fertilizers that are conventional will have a micronutrient package with them. in addition to secondary nutrients. So not just NP and K, but calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and then your micros, boron, iron, manganese, zinc. In organic production, my understanding is that you need to document that deficiency before you move forward with this approach. Oftentimes, fish and seaweed products will have those micronutrients, but they're not defined how much is in there. So I would also point out that most of the time in a healthy soil, I would say all of the time in my experience, it's not necessarily a deficiency of a nutrient, but there's some other problem that's going on there: compaction, pH, nutrient imbalance, and oftentimes that's the source of your deficiency, not a lack of it in your growing media. So here's another one of those soluble micronutrients. This one is a package, and it's got not just nitrogen and potassium, but it's also got boron, copper, iron, manganese, etc. So these options are out there for all of our growers. But if we want to correct one of these nutrients, particularly in an organic setting, we need to prove that the soil is deficient in that, or at least that the crop is. So soil testing is important if we're growing in the ground. Why is it important? Hopefully here you can see that I have a very high level of phosphorus, 836 pounds per acre, and my calcium is almost 9,000 pounds per acre. That tells me immediately that I do not want to apply any more of those nutrients because I'm going to restrict the uptake of some other nutrients because they're so imbalanced. You can see here my soil pH is 7.9. That's almost 8. And remember, I want to be down at 6, and that's a logarithmic scale, so I'm way too high. This is why it's so important that we acidify our water, and most people I work with that are growing in a tunnel or a soil-based greenhouse really would benefit from the addition of sulfur, elemental sulfur, to the soil every year. This applies to conventional growers and it applies to organic growers too. So we can see a lot of these micronutrient deficiencies and macronutrients for that matter. This happens to be an iron deficiency, very common right now when plants are growing very quickly. Here's a potassium deficiency. This is really unfortunate because it interferes with the number of flowers that are produced as well as the quality of fruit that we have. This is manganese, which is Mn. It's a micronutrient and oftentimes associated with high pH. So before I get to that point of seeing that I have a micronutrient deficiency, I want a foliar test. And so that foliar test then comes back, and here you can see red versus green, excessive versus deficient, where I am in the plant. And so I want a water test, I want a soil test, and I also want to foliar test. I really can't use a greenhouse injector intelligently unless I have all of this information. And this is some of our data where we looked at situations where people's soil pH goes up. Each one of those blue dots represents a soil sample. Our manganese, in particular, our micronutrient, goes down. I want to be between this green and red line. So as pH grows up, clearly I'm going to miss out on those micronutrients. And it's better to foliar test so that I grab those deficiencies and can correct them with my injector before they show up on the leaf. At that point, I'm already losing out. A few points on this water quality and why it matters that we pay attention to what we put in that stock bucket. You can see here some greenhouse grown cucumbers, and there's this white substance that's accumulating directly underneath these drip lines. That could be salt as well as it could be calcium bicarbonate or just calcium. It's more likely to be calcium at this point. Salts can build up. I want you to look at the roots here in my next few slides. Here's a healthy pepper transplant. Here's one where my salts are getting higher, and you can see some browned areas here, less roots relative to the above ground portion of the plant. And my electrical conductivity, which is a measurement of salts in the soil, is getting high, and I'm burning back those roots. And this is a severe situation where if that substrate is so salty, the plant simply can't put out any new roots. Of course, it'll starve. So oftentimes people will see these plants that have clear nutritional disorders and want to apply more fertilizers through their injection system, but that's actually the source of the problem. So we need to address these salts. One of the things we can do is, before we add any fertilizer to the system, is look at what they call a salt index. So how salty is our given fertilizers? This is from the University of Illinois, and it lists a lot of our common fertilizers on there. It doesn't mean that you never use one of these materials, but it means that you're mindful of how much and how often am I using one of these materials. Urea, for example, has a fairly high salt index, but occasionally can be useful as a standalone nitrogen source because it has no other nitrogen, it has no other nutrients with it. And oftentimes with indoor growing, we have excess of certain things such as phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and a standalone nitrogen is really welcome. That applies to both conventional in the case of urea, or if I was an organic grower, I might look at something soluble like Chilean nitrate. I also want to look at my fertilizer's influence on soil pH. And in interest of time, I'm going to move past that, aside from saying that generally nitrogen can be divided into nitrate nitrogen versus ammonia or urea-based nitrogen. And nitrate nitrogen, NO3, is going to raise your pH, which I hope I've made the point. Generally, that's one of our major challenges. So we want to avoid generally calcium fertilizers indoors. Compost, if we're going to apply it, we want to know what we're applying, how much calcium is in that, avoiding line and avoiding nitrate forms of N. We need to irrigate or acidify our water. And again, looking at elemental sulfur, peat moss is a great acidifier, and whether you're growing in a mix or in ground, it also, of course, improves the tilth of our soil. Check my clock here real quick. All right, I've got about 2 minutes left before I want to move to questions.
I'll just take a second here to unmute.
I'm not. Am I muted?
Nope, you're good.
I'm good. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to put out my socials in case anyone has any questions that I didn't do a good job answering, which is pretty easy to imagine as I move through that material very quickly. So I'm gonna stop with the PowerPoint now, Sue, and go to Q&A or whatever else you want to do.
Okay, so definitely at this time, feel free to use the questions box to ask any questions that you might have, but I'm also going to go through and unmute everybody. So at this time, you're going to have to keep yourself muted if you don't want to be heard. So we're going to hear some background, but this is my idea for making sure that people who want to speak up and ask a question can do so.
Yeah, I love. Yep.
With the hose.
So, Georgette, did you have a question there?
Not right now.
Okay, thanks. There's a question. Does anyone ever use liquid fraction of manure or digestate for fertigation, and would that be approved for organic use?
Boy, great question. And you're welcome to chime in, Sue, or anyone else who feels like they can on these questions. You're not going to be able to inject that stuff. And you'd also, when manure-based product, you have to look at food safety issues, which we're not covering tonight, but that's probably your primary concern. Though manure is a great source of fertility, but if we're taking a precision approach to fertility, it generally is not really the balanced ratio that we want in our plants for indoor growing. And you also have issues with salts because oftentimes there's salt in livestock rations.
Okay, yeah, that's a helpful answer. Another question sort of maybe along the same lines. What's the reason for avoiding compost, nitrate, and lime?
Great question. So I'll do that in reverse order. So lime, we are avoiding it because it generally drives our pH up. And my experience is that most growers in the Northeast don't realize when they water, they are applying lime because there's dissolved lime in what we call calcium bicarbonate in the water. That may not apply to you. Every so often there is someone who has a low alkalinity water. So the reason we would have to ask, why do you want to apply lime? Two main reasons. One is pH and the other is calcium. So you want to do a soil test, and if your calcium is low, and if you have abundant harvests of a fruiting vegetable, that is going to export a lot of calcium. But you could apply calcium to that setting without raising the pH in the form of gypsum or calcium nitrate, drive the pH less than lime would. So it's not a 100% rule, but most people do not need to apply lime because they're applying it continually in minute amounts in their irrigation water. Compost, I'm okay with compost. I would prefer a plant-based compost to an animal manure compost for a few reasons. The animal-based composts tend to be very high in phosphorus, and that can build up in our indoor production very quickly. And I've already mentioned a couple other reasons why not. Nitrogen is okay, but it can drive pH up. It's not, it doesn't drive up pH as much as alkalinity does, but it's just something to be mindful of. And the truth is, sometimes it's very hard to get the perfect fertilizer for what you need, and you have to make some compromises. So it's okay sometimes to compromise on nitrogen. That's fine. Just be mindful of the fact that it may drive your pH, particularly container production.
Okay, does that answer the question? There's a question about how to lower very high salt, a farm with high pH and low calcium.
pH and low calcium.
And very high salt.
Very high salts. Yeah, so that is a tough situation. If salts are difficult to get out of water, and so one of the tests that you can have in addition to pH and alkalinity of your irrigation water is something they call total dissolved solids, TDS. And the TDS is kind of a quick and dirty way to look at what your salt level is. Most will also look at salts, specifically sodium, Na, but hopefully other salts as well. The most common way, really the best way to get rid of salts is reverse osmosis. That is really difficult to put into a commercial ag system because it wastes so much water. You can do that in a domestic sink, for example, in your kitchen sink, but to do that with, say, a greenhouse where you might be using 500 gallons of water a day, and you might end up creating 3 times that of wastewater through reverse osmosis, you'd have 1,500 gallons of wastewater per day. It's really not practical. So I know this isn't very encouraging, but if you have high water, you may look at another water source. Can I get possibly another water source? What was the other part of that question, Sue?
The question was how to lower the salt content given that they have these.
Yeah, if it's in your water, it's very difficult to lower. Now the counterintuitive thing here is if you have a high salt water, it's actually better to use more of it than to use less. Because if you use less, what happens is that every time you use it, you're going to evaporate some water and you're going to concentrate salts. And you're concentrating every time you use a small amount. Whereas if you use a larger amount and you can leach through the root zone, you will return to the original salt level of what that water is in the first place. So don't underwater if you have high salt water.
Okay. Let's see, there's more questions here. Should you flush drip lines after fertigating?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Or can you just keep a low rate of fertilizer in the lines all the time?
It's a great question. If you're using organic materials, you generally do want to flush not just the lines, but the injector itself. The injector has a lot of moving parts inside and a lot of seals. And most of our organic forms of fertilizers are not truly soluble. It's really kind of suspended solids that are in there, and that can create problems. So you want to chase that with clear water if you can. With conventional fertilizers, oftentimes if you're using, say, something like a calcium nitrate, you might want to run clear water after that. Otherwise, most of the time you're going to be okay in that the conventional materials are soluble enough that they're not going to clog up your system. If you're not acidifying your water, you're more likely to clog up your system because there's going to be more calcium particulates that are going to clog up. I had one other thought there and I forgot what it was. Well, and that is just running clear water in general. And so I've talked about creating a stock solution. I've talked about how to calculate your acid, how to calculate your parts per million of nitrogen. I should have also mentioned that you should run clear water through that whole system, not just to maintain the system, but also to move any salts or other materials through the root zone, whether that root zone is a container, or in this case, it's a high tunnel, or anything else for that matter. I highly suggest that people at least have one clear water day per week.
Okay. There were a couple questions about precipitation of minerals in pipes or drip lines. One that came in. Yeah, how to avoid that, and then what are the risks maybe due to calcium in the water, and would that be controlled by acidifying?
Acidifying is going to control that a lot. And then there's certain materials that you don't want to combine. And so large scale greenhouses will have separate tanks for materials that will pre-mix those materials and dilute them before they move into an irrigation line. The calcium products in particular can precipitate out if they're combined with phosphates or sulfates. So that is and iron. Most people are not injecting a lot of iron. Iron and phosphorus can combine to create iron phosphate, which is insoluble. So any of those combos, calcium being the biggest one, can gum up a system pretty thoroughly. So avoid combining those. And so that's when you have a stock bucket that might be calcium nitrate, and then you have another one that might have your sulfates in it, for example, sulfate of potash, which is a 0050 or 0052, and run clear water in between those two applications. Keeping your acid in the system at all times is going to prevent the buildup of calcium.
Okay. There are a couple of questions I think that we've sort of touched on, and I think maybe the underlying question is like, is there what do you recommend organic growers use in the drip? Like, what are the simplest, most effective, cost-effective products to use?
Yeah, so if I'm an organic grower, I guess I think we all understand that the basis for organic growing really is healthy soils. Soils that on their own are able to provide the basis for crop nutrition, whether that's through the release of nitrogen or other materials. So if we're growing in a container, it's still a soilless mix for physical reasons. It's probably largely a soilless mix, yeah, for physical reasons of root health. but it's still largely going to be compost based, so that there are some there is going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, hopefully some micronutrients in that pot, equivalent to there being some in the soil, into a healthy soil. There's probably not going to be enough. So generally what I tell growers to look at if they're growing in ground in a greenhouse, a high tunnel, organic, I would look at applying probably about 75% of my nitrogen ahead of time in a pre-plant form. So that could be blood meal, it could be alfalfa meal, it could be soy meal, it could be feather meal, any one of those. And then late in the season, if my certifier allows it, I could use something called Chilean nitrate, which is a 1400. It's highly soluble. It acts like a conventional fertilizer. But I would wait until I get later in the season and I run out of gas from the stuff, from the, hopefully the nutrition I have in the soil.
Now, one grower who was asking about this mentions that Chilean nitrate contributes to too much sodium building up quickly in the soil.
It is. It's going to have a higher sodium rating, a salt index than some of the other materials.
Okay, so just front load with something else so you're not relying on it.
It is, but yeah, you can't go 100%. You know, here's one that is based on soy protein hydrolysate. I can barely say that, but this is a new material. Hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yeah.
That's 14%. And so that should not be, I don't have a salt index on that, but if it's based on soy protein, that should not be bringing in salts.
Okay.
Just to be mindful of what these things cost.
Yeah. Okay. Before we have to close, there is a question about resources. Like, can you recommend a handbook for drip fertigation? Where can folks go to get recommendations?
Well, Sue, I should probably mention some land grant here in the Northeast, but my favorite resource for these things, it actually comes out of Canada, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food, OMAF. Their greenhouse growers guide, they have two. They have one that's directed at pest management and one that's directed at kind of the crop management side of things. Those are outstanding. OMAF, Greenhouse Vegetable Guide, and that really walks you through a lot of the PPM calculations that I talked about here tonight, acidification, and all of those irrigation considerations that I talked about.
Do you know if that's available online?
I think it is a pay. You do have to pay for it, which is a little different for us, but I think it's very affordable, and I think it's entirely worth it. I think it is available as a PDF if you want to download it.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we got to that before anyone might have to leave. But there's a few more questions. How do you manage irrigating high tunnel crops when we tend to see really high organic matter? So in this field, there's 14% organic matter, so the soil doesn't really ever dry out. Do you have any recommendations for high organic matter, wet soil?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So high organic matter soils, generally my experience is we are managing just a couple of things because are beyond sufficiency. And so generally we're looking at nitrogen and potassium and pH. And so we really are zeroing in on applying those things in isolation. So one of my more reliable nitrogen sources in an organic setting is still blood meal, which is a 1200. So the 00 part of that I really like. I don't want more phosphorus, and my potassium I kind of like managing that separately. So blood meal is not really soluble, so I have to side dress that, or I could pre-plant broadcast it. I would plant broadcast sulfur as well, because if my organic matter is high, I can just about guarantee you that my pH is high too. And then finally, potash. Organic growers have a fantastic material called sulfate of potash, and that is soluble and it is very high in potassium. It's, again, I think it's a 0052. Or is it 48? It doesn't matter. It's around 50. So a very high, very soluble source of potassium that can be injected. And that's a good, that material is something I recommend to conventional growers. I think it's that good. So generally, high organic matter soils, I'm looking at pH, nitrogen, potassium for tomato growth.
I think the question was also just about like it's too moist in the soil to be having to, like if you're applying a lot of the fertility with water, then your soils are staying pretty wet and maybe you're having other issues that come along with wet soil.
Yeah, definitely could be. Wish I had good advice for that. Generally, high organic matter soils are going to be lighter, and they actually they evaporate a lot of water. So oftentimes they can go through more water fluctuations than a soil that has a higher mineral fraction. So I'm surprised to hear that if it's still too wet, I'd say there's some other issue in terms of what does drainage look like in that situation. Below that high organic matter layer. Do they need to think about putting in tile drainage possibly?
Okay. There's a few more questions. I don't know if you have time. We're a little bit over now, but one simple one. What were the names of the injectors that you talked about earlier?
Yep, I mentioned the first one is Chemilizer, just like it sounds, with a Z in there. Maybe Sue can type that in. And the other, Dosatron. Those just happen to be the two most common ones in my experience for Northeast growers. There are other brands out there, and I don't mean to show a favoritism over either one of those. They're both reputable, and they both work just fine. The Chemilizer is probably a little bit simpler to use because it's a fixed rate. It's 1 to 100 all the time, whereas a lot of Dosatron models are adjustable.
Okay, and those were different than ones you might recommend for field fertigation.
Right. Yeah, where say I just want to move out 5, 10, 15 pounds of nitrogen per acre. There I could use what they call a hose-on, H-O-Z-O-N, or a Venturi, V-E-N-T-U-R-I, Venturi siphon. And again, those are siphons that are more dependent on water pressure for their ratio, and oftentimes have very low ratios.
Okay.
So you're pushing out a lot of material at once. Very inexpensive though, and not a lot of maintenance or anything like that, and can be left out in the rain.
What was the first one? Hose?
Hose on. Isn't that hose on? H-O-Z-O-N. Another quick point I should mention is to, if you do have an injector and you have an unheated high tunnel, bring that injector into a heated space or a non-freezing space in the wintertime. It'll go bad on you.
Okay. Maybe a last question. We've talked a lot about limitations in organic fertilizers and high salt accumulation. Is there any downside to using high salt fertilizer and just flushing the soil as the salt builds up?
Quick answer is no. And so if we take the other measures that I glossed over very quickly in this presentation to keep salts low, you can get away with a fertilizer that has a fairly high salt index, particularly if you're growing a crop that has a high salt tolerance. Tomatoes are the #1 vegetable crop indoors, and they're actually fairly tolerant of salts compared to other vegetable crops. Greenhouse plastic really should be removed every 3 years most of the time because the light quality degrades. And so if every 3 years you were to remove your plastic and give it a full season of rain and snow, you would also drive your salts down. If you have a movable high tunnel, your salts are going to not really be an issue. Yeah, if you take the plastic off, your salts are not going to be an issue. If you have the water source and you flood the soil at the end of each season, salts are not going to be an issue. So those are all options.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining. And thanks a lot to Judson Reid from Cornell for sharing his I would call it expertise. I would say
Well, and thanks to you, Sue, for having me and for organizing and moderating. I appreciate it.
we're happy to have you.
Yeah,
And
and
we'll have
I just wanted to
Sorry.
say thanks to all the farmers that are out there doing the work that they do. It's hard work, and I want you to know you're greatly appreciated for what you do.
a nice thought to end on there. So thanks everyone for joining, and we do have a call in 2 weeks on weed management. So hopefully see some of you then. And